My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. I do most of my blogging at creativitydiscourse.com, and I review movies at cinemadiscourse.com, where we look at movies from a mythological point of view. And you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. I'm going to talk now about pop and radical architecture in the 1960s, and we'll start with England and Europe. So, how many people have watched Downton Abbey? Not your kind of thing, right? Well, there was a series some years ago that it's modeled after called Upstairs, Downstairs. And so here's the upstairs, the aristocrats living in the mansion, and here are the servants. And so I want to begin with the idea of a major problem in English culture, which is the class structure. Something that they still have not gotten over. And in the attempt to get over it, the elites would go to Oxford or Cambridge, and starting in the late 1800s, they built what's called the red brick schools, which were started as mostly technical schools, but the idea is they would be as good as Oxford and Cambridge and be for the working classes. And so what happens is you go to one of those schools, you're as smart as the snots who go to the elite school, and you still don't get anywhere because it's a classist society. And so the documentation of that is the works of a group of playwrights called the Angry Young Men, most prominently John Osborne, and his play addressing this look back in anger. Now, Mick Jagger went to the London School of Economics. He wanted to be a banker. No way that he was going to, he could be a clerk in a bank, but he didn't come from the right family, so he wasn't going to be a banker. So what can a poor boy do but sing for a rock and roll band? And that's why I was playing that when you came in, which leads us to Archigram. So Archigram's a group of architects from the AA, Architectural Association, and I'm not going to go through them by name, so I'm going to refer to Archigram. But it is a group of people, some of them still quite prominent, some of them occasionally lecture here at Pratt, and whose work was futurist, pro-consumerist, and we're going to look at that as a contrast to some other European thought, inspired by and at the same time satirizing technology, and they did not build. And so it's drawings, not built projects that we will be looking at. Now, you get out of school in England, and there's the dominant office is the London County Council, and this is what it does. So this is what, you have fun in school, and now you can spend the rest of your life doing a dreary job, doing dreary public housing. So they decided maybe they wouldn't do that, and instead they would publish their work. And we're in a revolutionary period. We're going to see that revolution unfold. And so they're not going to start a serious magazine to compete with AD or, in America, Architectural Record. They're going to publish their work in comic books. And so this is the amazing Archigram 4. And we see this imagery. It's kind of 1930s Flash Gordon imagery. This is the key work. This is, if you think Archigram, this is the work you'll think. Plug-in City, 1964. And what do we see here? We see a rich network of infrastructure. And now we've always had infrastructure. That's what's under the street. That's the street, plus then the sewers, the electricity, the telephones, the water. But what if that's treated in 3D and not just buried in 1D, one level in the streets? And what if we build these frameworks and then the units are plugged in? So You get a new car every 3 or 4 years. Trade in the old one, get a new one. Why aren't you getting a new apartment every 3 or 4 years? So here's someone has traded in their old apartment, and they're getting delivery on the new apartment, which is prefabricated in industrial conditions, the way automobiles are. So it's economical, affordable, technological, up-to-date, and it just slides into your unit. Here's some other imaginings of these plug-in units. So here is a structure with spiral on the bottom of parking, and then here's our floors. We have elevators in the center. You come out, here are the units, and these units are, here's someone who's traded in their old unit and getting a new one. Now, these are very imaginative thinking, but it's still not, the times are not that affluent yet. So these units are rather minimal. This is your unit. And remember how tight the units were in Corbu's Unité d'Habitation. There's not a lot of affluence there yet, but there's enough that we can start at least making our small unit fun. And so we've got our built-in entertainment system. Maybe this is the bathroom, maybe this is the shower. Here's our fold-down bunk bed. And so they think a lot about these units. Now, these units are thought of as capsules. And what's the ultimate capsule? Of course, is a lunar landing module, which kept people alive 250,000 miles away from home, everything they needed. And so, maybe we should be borrowing from that technology. So Archigram does their own lunar landing module. And it's also, they play an analogy against the human heart. So this looks like a diagram of ventricles and stuff like that that hearts have. And here's a coronary artery on the outside of our heart. So it's sort of a three-dimensional capsule, an actual model. But you can see they're having fun because the pads on the feet are soda pop bottles, caps. So there's always a touch of humor, playfulness, and fun in what they're doing. And as focused as they were on the capsules, they also focus on the network. So here's a network, and they're inspired by printed circuits. Now, printed circuits, I'm going to say we occasionally, what we had in those days before they invented the chip. So the chip is basically a printed circuit shrunk down to today. You now get 1 billion transistors on the size of your fingernail and all the wires in between. But this is what we had in those days. And this would have been, what we're looking at there, about 9 inches square or something. And so rather than when you were a kid, you got a Heath kit and you're there with your soldering iron getting a wire from this node of the capacitor to that one, printed circuits, just in one printing process made the whole thing. So it was already a big jump. And architects are looking at these technologies. Of course, the first one they looked at was what? Henry Ford. And this guy's churning out automobiles. The first Model T was $800, and 8 years later, they're $400. And we're still building the way the Egyptians did. So, the architects are looking at these other technologies and are being inspired by them. And the forward-thinking ones want to bring these technologies into architecture. So that's one of the things Archigram is doing, but they're doing it tongue-in-cheek and having fun at it, in being inspired by the circuit board for their city as network. Now think about mobility. Everybody's been looking at Airstream. Now, there are a lot of trailers out there, whether they're mobile homes that never move, they sit on concrete blocks, or they go attached to the back of your, your pickup truck, but Airstream was the one that was very appealing because it's well, it won't burn. It'll be in trouble in a fire, but it's made out of aluminum instead of wood. So everybody's looking at the Airstream trailer, and Archigram is inspired by this idea of mobility. So here we have our capsules. Our capsules can be mobile, and of course there's always been trailer parks, but why aren't they high-rise? And so this idea of an infrastructure and you plug in your capsule, yeah, it's called a trailer park. We've been doing it for years, and just make it high-rise. And so this is Free Time Node, which is your plug-in. And when you arrive in your trailer at a trailer park, you plug into the sewage, water, electricity and TV antenna. This is providing all those services for our plug-in capsule. Now, the thinking is also, a lot of what we've been seeing the past few weeks has been criticisms of large-scale planning. And so one of the people commenting on that here in this country is Jane Jacobs, Death and the Life of Great American Cities. But you also, the Smithsons do Team 10 Primer, and they talk about why tear down whole neighborhoods? Why not just this bad unit, you fix that unit? And so rather than just eliminate a whole neighborhood, which is going to, people never recover from that. You know, when you say, oh, we cleared this slum and we put up these high standard public housing. Well, what about the people who are living there? They never recover. So what if you could sort of drop the improvements in one at a time? So here's Archigram thinking in terms of these, all this modern stuff, communication units, capsules, being dropped into a neighborhood and, but leaving the fabric of the neighborhood there. Now, just so we can be, have a sense that there was a tongue-in-cheek here, here's a project called Seaside Bubbles, in which you go to the beach and the children are all in their plastic flotation devices paddling around, and these flotation devices are transparent and colorful, and so, oh, those are cute capsules, and so let's have those, that's our capsule city. And just to now take it a step further, it's a lot of work building one of these capsule cities, and you just want the look of it anyway. So why don't you just bring in a dirigible, drop down some bed sheets, and project your city? And here we are, Instant City. That's more work than you have to do. You don't even need that. Anybody guess what's the next step? You just take a pill that will produce whatever hallucinations you want. You want a colorful city, you want an emerald green city, you create a designer drug that will produce, so this is called Enviro Pill. And so this gives us a sense of the humor of Archigram. Well, I just want to quickly look at some, not just influences, but shall we say parallels to their thinking. So here is this capsule we were looking at, and instructors aside, what are we looking at here? Anybody? It's a first-class cabin on an Air Emirates flight from New York to Dubai. There's your capsule, exactly like their capsule. It's a 14-hour trip, and if you're rich enough or you're on expense account, this is how you fly, in your tiny little capsule with your entertainment system. Here is coffin or capsule hotels in Tokyo, and it's a long story, but the men who work stay late. It's a humongous commute to get home because of the green belt around Tokyo. By the time they get home, they have to, sleep for an hour and head back again. So you go to a hotel. Hotels are very expensive, so you get one of these little rooms. And there's your TV. You just Skype your wife, and here are these tiny little units. So here are these things, not necessarily influenced by Archigram, but parallels of it. And then this is Bertrand Goldberg's Marina Towers in Chicago, not plug-in, not prefabricated, but here's the exact imagery we were just looking at. Here's the spiral parking garage, open on the bottom, and then his units have these little balconies which give them these little bumps that sort of emulate the look of the capsules in Archigram. And here's Pompidou that we just looked at. Now, structurally, Pompidou is identical to Louis Kahn's Salk Center. These two columns and these humongous trusses here or verandels here. But visually, it's right out of Archigram. And so structurally, it's something else, but this visual imagery of all the exposed mechanical. And about those capsules, you recall Corbu's unité d'habitation is poured in place concrete, not prefabricated. But Corbu had envisioned that he wanted to make it like a structural frame, like a wine rack. And then the units would be prefabricated and slipped in. Disney did it. So here we are at the Contemporary Hotel in Disney World in Florida. Here it is under construction. They put up the frame. There's a factory that just churns out the rooms, right down to all the bedding. The beds are made and everything. They come in on flatbeds, lifted up on a crane, and slipped in. So here's Archigram's capsules. And when Disney World opened, architectural journalist Peter Blake was one of the first to get seriously there and lectured about it extensively. He says, everything we've been talking about, they did. There's Corbu's, the pedestrian level, and all the trucks are on a whole level underneath, just all these ideas as well. And then here is finally the New York Times recognized Alexander Shulgin, the great pioneer of designer drugs, with a major article. And so here, and you say, well, look, do you want 20 minutes or do you want like 12 hours? Do you want it, if it's sensuous, or do you want colors? And this is what he does, and which was their vision. So I'm going to put up a few slides here. It'll be up to my colleagues what's on the exam, but we'll call this the takeaway. So what do we take away from what we said about Archigram? So it's England in the 60s. They're reacting to a depressing establishment culture. They are outside the orthodoxy in both approach and practice. In approach, emphasizing technology, networks, and capsules, and embrace of modern life rather than a leftist rejection of it, and satire. In practice, drawings rather than built projects. Now we're going to come back to this, interesting here. And then there are many, they have many influences and there are many parallels to their work. Now, quickly, a couple of the Europeans before we get to America. These are three Austrians. It's sort of in our consciousness because one of them, Raymond Abraham, taught at Pratt for many, many years, as well as at Cooper Union. So first, Friedrich St. Florian. And here, this is New York. We have three major airports, and they used to stack up the airplanes, and they'd be in these holding spirals. Now they try not to let them take off unless they know they can land. But it used to be you sitting in your airplane, well, we're going to be stacked up for a half hour, and you look out their window, there's like 6 other airplanes, and we're all going in a big circle. And so that could be a structure. So he's thinking on like big scale. Now, St. Florian actually did the World War II memorial in Washington in the Mall, and let's just say it's very neoclassical. And other people maybe use stronger language. So if you want to ask what we mean by that, you can ask in section. This is Hans Hollein. And so, we're thinking about all this stuff. A battleship or an aircraft carrier, 30,000 people. It's a city. Totally self-sufficient. It doesn't go out at sea and be there for 6 months. They got everything they need. And they used to have a lot of fuel. Now they have nuclear power plants. So Hans Hollein takes an aircraft carrier, plops it into a landscape in this collage. That's all you needed to do, if you were imaginative enough. This is a project of his more recently. And then Raymond Abraham, he started doing kind of science fiction-y things. So here's this megastructure spanning a long distance here, the whole units. Later he did more sort of poetically expressive things. So this is a curtain wall structure, because it has walls that are curtains. And then he did the Austrian Cultural Center in Manhattan, which you see over there. Okay, some other Europeans, Super Studio, and I'm not going to say too much about these figures, but they thought in terms of the architecture of monument, the architecture of image, and technomorphic architecture. And they thought in terms of these huge structures, which, I mean, this is hitting Manhattan. It's probably coming from Europe. It's spanning the globe. And here is another one of their projects integrated with the landscape. And there's kind of very radical thought going on. Meredith spoke about that in terms of the other European theorists. And so they're addressing, there's a movement that we call, something we call New Marxism, which the early writing of Karl Marx was rediscovered, and apart from the, say, hardcore revolutionary Marxist position, there was a kind of a subtle analysis of what it means to be embedded in this consumerist society. And so that's one of the things these people are thinking about. So, if design is merely an inducement to consume, then we must reject design until all design activities are aimed toward meeting primary needs. Now, if I had enough time to linger on any one of these, we then get some futurist quotes to put together with this, and also the futurist boldness. Another group is Archizum, which is an ironic critique of the ideology of modernism. A lot of what's going on from the beginning of this semester, really, is, the past 3 weeks or so, is an ongoing critique of what you might call orthodox international style modernism. That's what these people are doing. The real revolution in radical architecture is a revolution of kitsch, mass cultural consumption, pop art, and industrial age language. So now they're for this stuff. So, okay, so now, United States in the 60s. Okay, first thing to observe. When the 60s, I just figured I'll go look at Wikipedia. So I'll take their dates. 60s is 63 to 74. I would date it a little bit later. I didn't have any awareness of anything happening until about maybe 67. I said, whoa, there's something happening. But there was stuff going on before that. I just wasn't involved. So any discussion of the United States begins, of course, with the automobile. And so after World War II, a colleague of Harvey Earl, the great automobile designer, he was General Motors' great designer, took Harvey Earl, born in Hollywood. And he was the king of all. When you see that giant design studio by Saarinen, that was his palace. In that stainless steel dome, he brought forth all the great automobiles of the 50s.
Wasn't there also this guy named Lowy?
Raymond Loewy did the Studebakers.
Right, but he was important.
And then Virgil Exner did the Chrysler cars, the forward look. But anyway, his friend took him out and said, look at that P-38 Lightning fighter plane. You got to put those on your cars. 1949, there it is on the Cadillac, the first tail fin. And this is my car, which I've finally sold to a collector. It's now the coolest car in Sweden. But this, I think, was the most perfect rendition of the tail fin. But then it gets, 1959, it is out of control. I mean, this comes up about to the middle of your chest. This was, now, all of a sudden, something else comes along. A totally new way of thinking. And this is a totally new encounter with the environment. The way you feel the road, the way that it's not just, well, we can't afford that. It's a whole new sensibility. We're moving from Father Knows Best, dominant, defining sitcom of the 50s, to Easy Rider. It's a total change in the cultural ethos, from frozen TV dinners to organic whole foods, from the organization man of IBM. This is Watson Jr. And now these guys are a little bit later, but this is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, a couple of freaks who built the Apple I, the Apple II, and the Apple computer that we all are walking around with on our belts. Yeah, but then also visionaries, the techno-visionaries. So now remember I showed you some kind of countercultural figures in my last lecture, and just look at one of the Norman Mailer, a book, Advertisements for Myself. In one of the essays in there, he contrasts the hip and the square. And he's envisioning not just, oh, let's have a new kind of building in our environment. These people are envisioning a new human being, a new society and a new human being. Hip is wild, square is practical. Hip is romantic, square is classical. Hip is instinct, square is logic. Now, this goes on for 7 slides, which I'm not going to go through, but if you happen to find this interesting, when you download this, you can have fun looking at these 2 lists. So, there are many claims to the 60s. I mean, a lot of different people want to claim it, define it in different ways. So again, I went to Wikipedia. Their 60s is Vietnam War, the British invasion, replacing rock and roll, the assassination of Kennedy, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, Woodstock and music, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, Stonewall, thank you. The beginning of gay consciousness, and the space program. So that's their 60s. Here's mine, and we won't pause for this because I'm going to do them one at a time, hopefully very quickly because we got a lot to get through. So, Revolution and the New Left. And there's 2 really different movements. There's hardcore Marxist revolutionaries. Everybody had Che Guevara posters up in their dorm room, and Mao's Little Green Book, Sartre's left-wing French philosophy, inspiring Pol Pot to kill 1/3 of the population of Cambodia. And then there's the New Left. And so here's Jean-Francois Revel, without Marx or Jesus. You know, maybe there's a totally new way of being that's not capitalist or Marxist. Challenging authority. The free speech movement came earlier at Berkeley. This is Mario Savio. And then 68, Columbia is occupied, Pratt at the same time. Pratt's revolution stuck a little bit longer. Architecture school was run by the all-school committee for about 4 years. So anything he wanted to do, everybody gathered and voted. And of course, the students way outvoted the faculty.
But in addition to the SDS, the main spark was set up by the architecture school at Columbia University.
Right, so we're at the center of this. End the war protest movement, and the 1968 was all over the world. So here it is in Paris, and Meredith just spoke about that. There was this moment after the discovery of the pill and before herpes and AIDS. There was like this window where, whoa! So everybody just took their clothes off and got in a big pile. And so there's the sexual revolution, sex and drugs and rock and roll. Feminism. Right. Feminism, the notion, radical at the time, that women should be the equal of men biologically, economically, career-wise, etc. And so the feminist movement, the women's consciousness in architecture, if you're interested in that, this book to this day is an excellent resource. It's in the library. Susanna Torre edited Women in American Architecture. New Age, so shamanism, Buddhism, meditation, all these things came rushing in. Everybody was doing them. Chronicled, you did it at Esalen on the cliffs over Big Sur, and this is a documentation of this, Marilyn Ferguson's Aquarian Conspiracy. LSD was of major importance. Here's Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters on their bus, documented by Tom Wolfe, the straightest guy you ever met, but somehow he managed to hang out and with them and write the electric Kool-Aid acid test. And here is Timothy Leary, the apostle of the whole thing. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Advocating LSD. And here's East Totem West poster, which I still have in my collection and still is not valuable. Somehow I thought it would become immensely valuable, but it's not. Comics, underground comics with an X, totally different thing than Superman and Donald Duck. And Here's R. Crumb, the great figure of underground comics. My favorite, the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers with their stash, always one step ahead of the cops. Rock music was probably, next to psychedelics, the most defining thing of the era. So we go from the rock and roll of Buddy Holly, the Beatles and the Stones bring rock. Carly Simon comes to the level of really serious poetry. And here we have Fillmore concerts with this psychedelic quality to it. A very serious rock opera, The Who's Tommy. The most psychedelic probably is Jim Morrison, The Doors, and a major cultural figure of the 20th century now, Bob Dylan.
Similar. Robert Allen.
Right. Now, not much technology. The establishment, got the IBM 360. We had, but this was the first step. This is the HP 35, the first scientific pocket calculator, and followed eventually by the HP 65, which was programmable. And so people started making games and hacking and stuff like that. The space program, the important thing there was we're out there looking back at the Earth. Suddenly the Earth is it's small. And Spaceship Earth, we're going to see that term come up when we look at Bucky Fuller. It's totally changed consciousness, launches the ecology movement. And along with this vision of a new person, here we are. The two centers of this culture are Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. Their paper is the San Francisco Oracle. Here we had St. Mark's Street?
St. Mark's
Place. Thank you. St. Mark's Place. This is where the Yippies were, Youth International Party, communes, the free store. You needed something, you just went there, picked it up. You had stuff you didn't need, you just dropped it off. Our paper was East Village Other, and the Yippies are running a pig for president. So, flower children are this notion of a totally new human being, and sort of is announced with the Summer of Love in '67. Everybody goes to San Francisco, takes their clothes off, and then '69 begins with Woodstock and ends with Altamont, where the Rolling Stones brought in the Hells Angels for their security guards, and they killed somebody, and it was like not funny anymore. And so what people thought of as going to be a totally new human being maybe didn't happen. A couple books, and then we'll summarize. My favorite, Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, understanding all these new electronics as extensions of consciousness. Herbert Marcuse, member of the Frankfurt School, bringing this European thought here, the idea that there can be social repression even in the abundance of a consumer society, terms like surplus affluence. Point being that you are titillated to the point where no matter how much you have, you still want more. Norman Brown Loves Body, a very Freudian look at civilization and eroticism. Chungam Trungpa Rinpoche is the first Tibetan master to come to the West. And there's now starts to be really serious access to Buddhist thought. I mean, it just was vaguely accessible before 1960. And a few British and German anthropologists had penetrated it, and there's some translations, but suddenly it's pouring in with heavy-duty masters available.
Allen Ginsberg.
He was one of the students of it. He was a student of Trungpa.
Right, and Trungpa had a kind of a scandal at the end.
Oh, yeah.
But he was an interesting cat.
Right. And then Joseph Campbell, the idea that myths live in us today. People start becoming as interested in Jung as they are in Freud. And the notion in Jung is that that your unconscious is not just repressed sexual desires, but all of human culture is in your unconscious and expressed in mythology. Now, this is the most important book I have here. And because what Pauline Kael, who was the movie critic for The New Yorker, did was to totally seamlessly marry high culture and popular culture. Before this period, you read comics when you were in high school, and then you get to college and you read, you know, you read Camus' The Stranger. And this generation said, no, we're going to keep reading comics. You know, you listen to popular music at school, and now you listen to Mozart. No, we're gonna make our pop music our serious music. And so you get this blending of popular, which is exactly what Archigram was doing. Where they were not saying, okay, now we have to be serious and be Corbeau and Mies. No, they're going to stay with their comic books and their automobiles and their popular culture and make that their high culture. And that's what Pauline Kael stood for. Now, if you're interested in this whole thing, I feel that the best presentation of it is a movie called Across the Universe. It's a romantic movie about a guy in England. He comes over here, meets a girl in the US, but it has a very strong music track. And you cannot get this period from a book because the music and the visuals is like 80% of what it was about. And this movie is a very good presentation of that. So our takeaway. The US in the 60s, major cultural upheavals. There's a challenge to the establishment culture of conformity and repression by a counterculture, and that became the term counterculture, of revolution, individuality, and psychedelics. And the intention was to make a new society and a new human being. We would do away with aggression, violence, and war, and replace it with peace and love, and mold a new human being. That was the vision. So, the US, art. A lot of interesting things going on in the arts, and we're going to look at only one. Actually, Art Povera is a European movement, but most of these are.
No, he's up at the beginning.
So, we'll just look at, because I got to get to the architecture, we're just going to look at one figure. But before we do that, I presented this as pretty revolutionary a couple of weeks ago. This is a Jackson Pollock drip painting. Whoa, what is that? But is that really any different from a Monet? It is still painterly. It's still what a painting should be in look and feel and texture. This is a revolution. This is like, whoa, wait a minute. How do you get from Picasso to that? So, our key figure is Andy Warhol, died prematurely in a botched hospital situation. And
there would be no war without Marcel Duchamp.
It's Duchamp.
I had a Duchamp slide, and I just figured I got a lot to go through. Okay. But yes, we start looking back at Duchamp instead of Picasso. Thank you. Duchamp was very generous to young artists to come and hang out at his studio. So we know Warhol for his soup cans and other popular consumer things. His popular cultural figures, here's Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, and who's the other one? Elvis! But his main creation was himself. So the idea was that these are two Andy Warhol superstars. On the left is Viva, and on the right is Ultraviolet, and who still has a studio and is an artist in New York today. And here they are in the 1968 on the front of the New York Times Magazine section. So projecting a new kind of cultural exuberance of the art world, the nightlife, these cultural figures, the art itself, all wrapped up in one exciting phenomenon. Now, I was really disciplining myself that I was only going to look at one, but 2 days ago I went to look at the La Bruce show. and which you got to see. It's unbelievable. And they are right now mounting a Klaus Oldenburg show. So the other artist I was going to show you was Klaus Oldenburg. This is a giant clothespin in Philadelphia. And so, I mean, I had great Oldenburg stuff, but I really want to move along. But I only put this in there April 14th to August 5th. So as soon as you're done with your design projects, get over there and see the Oldenburg show. So our takeaway on art in the 60s, rebellion.
You should mention Frank Gehry because Klaus Oldenburg.
He will. Let him go on.
Frank Gehry comes later. You guys do that. So, rebellion, humor, satire, borrowing from the ordinary and popular culture, thus pop. Pop art means popular. Rejection of tradition, rejection of painterly. That art has to look like art, like your parents' art. Okay, so we get to architecture. So, a lot of figures. For a while I had in here some other figures, and I had Bruce Goff, and go look at Bruce Goff. But it's really, he's something else, and there's just a limit to what we can do here. But Solari, who you can see is quite old, is part of the spirit of this time. So he's in the 1960s, he's out in the desert. He'd already done work in Italy. He was acquainted with Frank Lloyd Wright. He'd get a bulldozer, make a mound. This is all in Arizona. Make a mound, then throw some rebars over that, pour concrete in that, get in there, dig it out, and he's making shelters. And very appropriate to the desert. This is Casante, his home and shops. He supported himself for years selling these bells. And this is Arco Sante. And so there's endless drawings of his visionary, futuristic city. And he labeled it, he said, it'll be ecological. So then all of a sudden, he became a major figure. Oh, he put ecological under it. And so, but there's no engineering done here. It's all just visionary. And this is not really a start on constructing it, but you can go, and I recommend it, you can go there for 6 weeks in the summer in their program and work on building these structures. They have a series of domes and half domes and stuff like that out there in the desert, and an educational program, and it's really cool stuff. So the person we're going to focus now on is Bucky Fuller. And Fuller is first of all, he's eclectically self-educated. He doesn't come from any tradition, but he has a real engineer's instincts. So he gets labeled, he got thrown out of Harvard. So he comes from a prominent family, Margaret Fuller, major figure in American history. So he comes from a prominent family, but he couldn't find himself. And he's all this stuff, architect and futurist. He taught, his key teaching was probably at Black Mountain College, but he taught everywhere. He taught many, many places, and finished his career at University of Pennsylvania. One of our faculty, Haresh Alvani, did his PhD under Bucky Fuller at Penn. So in 1922, his daughter died, and he was devastated by this. For a year, he did not talk. And he thought about, what can I do? What can one person do? What can a single individual could contribute to changing the world and benefiting all humanity? And then he finally decided, he committed himself to the search for the principles governing the universe and help advance the evolution of humanity in accordance with them, finding ways of doing more with less. That's our phrase for Bucky Fuller. To the end that all people everywhere can have more and more. Now, this is a small part of a little drawing he does, set of drawings, proposal he does in 1927. Mass producing apartment buildings, extremely, we'll see how in a few minutes, lightweight, fly them in with a blimp and drop them down. Prefabricated apartment buildings just dropped in. And working out how to do this. He's most famous for the geodesic dome. He didn't invent it, but he developed it. You see hints of this already in Alexander Graham Bell, who's pioneering space frames way back at the late 1800s. He developed this when he was at Black Mountain College, which was a remarkable place and a gathering. You make the list of, people, it's a who's who of the artists of the 50s, the faculty at Black Mountain. And the idea of these things are extremely lightweight. They got used by the military to put on top of radar things because they don't block the radar and they protect them from the weather. This is his diaxiom. He makes up these words. Diaxiom house. If you think it'd be fun to live in an upside down aluminum pie plate. This is his diaxiom car, engineeringly very remarkable. He was friends with an important sculptor and who's also a colleague of many architects, including Louis Kahn. Izumo Noguchi, who did the body shape for this thing, actually worked with a wind tunnel. And then these bold thought experiments, like what if you put a dome over all of Midtown Manhattan? And part of the idea is there's this huge surface area of all these spikes. All these buildings are spikes, maximizing exterior surface area, losing heat in the winter. But you get an ideal ratio of volume to surface area with a dome. Now these ideas are you take an entire town, you put it in a sphere, you raise the temperature. Now at this time everybody was like, we're going to run out of space. We're going to run out of space. We're going to, there's too many people. Well, you raise the temperature 2 degrees above the ambient temperature and it floats, no matter how big it is. And there's plenty of room up there. So the ability to think that way. His most famous build project is the American Pavilion at Expo 67, which is a World's Fair in Montreal. Maximizing surface area. Maximizing volume, minimizing surface area, and minimizing weight. So here was that view from space of the Earth, and Fuller writes a book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. He totally caught on in the 60s. He was at many schools, I can't say every, lecturing everywhere. And he did something called the World Game. And this was a way that you come into a school and there'd be a week-long project in which you'd work something out. And the end was always to make the world work for 100% of humanity, solving water or pollution or electricity and this is a map, the Diaxiom world map that he invented. It's always a problem with Mercator projections and everything. There's always some kind of distortion when you put a 3D globe on a flat surface. This is probably the best solution. And this config, which is to use tetrahedron. But here you can do it different ways. So here you can focus on the oceans. Here you suddenly realize Europe, Asia, North Korea is one continuous landmass. You could have one continuous electrical grid. And it's always going to be nighttime somewhere. And at nighttime, you're generating electricity that nobody in your section of the grid uses. But if you can ship it over to where people are just starting to go to work and turning on their toasters, so the ability to think globally this way. And finally, here is this dome at Expo 67. Here's a pyramid. Pyramid's got a lot of material, very little space. So Fuller sort of promotes the idea that the history of architecture is a decrease in material and an increase in space, a growth in efficiency, a very engineering point of view, but this is his point of view. Here's this apartment building we just saw. This is a single-family house. So he's saying it's going to be much lighter than a single-family house. So our takeaway, Bucky Fuller, doing more with less. All problems are susceptible to engineering and design solution. Fuller was not really interested in aesthetics or culture. It's really engineering and design. And my guess, if you got a required image for Bucky Fuller, it would be the American Pavilion at Expo 67. Now we're only going to look at one other architect. This is a group called Ant Farm, Chip Lord and Doug Mitchells. And they named themselves after the, well, years ago, the back of comic books were ads for something called an ant farm. And it's a little plastic gizmo. It's only about this big. And it's 2 pieces of plastic with sand in between. You had to get your own ants. And then the ants would go in here and they'd make a colony. You could watch them. So they were just fascinated by this, and they called themselves Ant Farm. And this is what they would do. They'd go places and buy huge sheets of plastic, heat seal them, back up a fan in them, and you got a construction, you got a structure. You can get in there. You know, how hard is it to make a building? Here it is. It took an hour and a half. We used to do these at Pratt. And this idea of inflateds was very much around. So there's an Italian group that did what's called the blow chair. I remember deciding, should I buy one of these? It was like $1,200, which is like a month's salary. and that, but you know, net gross salary, you know, it'd be about 2 months take home. And you know, it's going to go out of style in 6 months. Probably would have been fun to have one, but I never bought it. Here we are at the Osaka World's Fair, just 3 years after Expo 67, and huge structures made out of inflated. So this idea, this is even less material than a geodetic dome. The signature project of Ant Farm is Cadillac Ranch. So we began America with the tail fins. And here is every Cadillac from 1949 to 1963, stuck in the ground. They got a big backhoe dug, put down a concrete footing in there, put it in there, filled it back in. And you're driving across, if you take the southern route across the, oh my God, there it is. And for the first few years, it got full of bullet holes, because this is Texas. And then now, this is what they look like. So they sort of absorbed American culture being out there over the decades. It's now, how many years? 74, 40 years. And they did do a house of the century in Texas. Somewhat phallic, but really fun futurist. And it's poured in place concrete, and then they took all of the wood for the formwork and laminated it together to make these solid interiors, and then they had these heavy-duty, this is really ugly, heavy-duty power grinders to sculpt this stuff. And you needed gas masks to, you know, for the sawdust being kicked up, to sculpt in these seating areas, sculpted this magnificent sink. There's a little TV here, your view out at the lake, and then coating it with heavy-duty polyurethane. So, Ant Farm, humor, satire, celebration of American popular culture. The automobile. I was just yesterday out of my storage space, and I had an Ant Farm book on the American automobile culture. I said, no, I can't add that stuff as well. But anyway, if you look on half.com, you can get their book. Rejection of Conventional Practice. And finally, Expo 67, where this stuff happened on a real big scale. So there are a lot of interesting buildings there. Actually, one of the most interesting was the Cuban Pavilion. It was not a huge thing. It was a beautiful little building. And I didn't find any good slides, so, and mine are in boxes somewhere. So, but it was a huge thing, and I don't always go to expos, but this thing was like, you got to go. This was just so much in the architectural consciousness. So, 3 buildings you should know from Expo 67 is Frei Otto's West German Pavilion. Frei Otto worked in these sort of tents of steel cable, which then hold canvas. and then you have free, flexible space underneath. And this is probably one of the bigger ones that he was able to do. Friar is still alive. Moishe Softy. It's called Habitat. And these are, you know, as architects, we're always interested in the potential of prefab. And so here are prefab units. Now, something different from what we've seen before. Anybody? What's technically different in these prefab units? No framework. These things support themselves. Different approach. Now, there's a big problem with that, which means the bottom one has to hold up all the ones above it. And it also means that they're all going to be different. Obviously, you're going to make the walls thicker on the bottom one than you do on the top one. So you can't just mass produce them all identically. So, you know, if you were going to do this, you might more likely go this way. But this was really exciting. It's still lived in today. It's an apartment complex. And the American Pavilion by Bucky Fuller. It had a fire, yeah. If you go to Google Image and you put in Bucky Fuller, you know, Expo 60, you'll see an image with it on fire. So our takeaway, Expo 67 had used bold architectural technologies, and these are the three examples you should know from that. And finally, in New York, the center of energy was around the Architectural League. One of the sort of modernist architects of the day, Ulrich Franzen, had steered the league in terms of doing very bold experimental stuff. And I've narrowed it down to just 2 projects, but there was a lot of exciting, actually 3, exciting projects. So this is one I did. And what I did was I took the 3 spaces of the gallery, I put a diagonal 3-foot grid in black tape on the floor. I'm not the most imaginative person, but it's interesting what you can do with a little imagination. You know, like people can say, aren't you lucky that that grid was on the floor? But no, I just bought some electric tape. How hard was that? Then I put 2 hollow core doors put together in an L, and the spatial experience is mind-blowing. I mean, half of all the people in there swore there were mirrors, which there weren't.
Is this an exhibition space?
It was environmental exhibits.
And this was at the League?
The Architectural League on 65th Street, which it shared with the Municipal Art Society.
What year was it?
About 67. I should know. I'd have to look at my resume, but I think 67.
It has something in common with some Italian things that we've done.
It was totally in the air, and there's a guy named John Margulies who was the curator who selected me, and he did Les Levine's slipcover, which I took out because, you know, this thing could have ballooned.
It's actually very different than Enzo Mari, because Enzo Mari's environments are scaled towards children.
My idea was, I think this was the first time anybody ever did a grid that just ran into the wall. In other words, everybody sort of, well, you want to put something in the space, but to absolutely, and a lot of stuff for the next few years, I could see my influence on. And then one of the things I curated was a remarkable artist named James Lee Byers. And he, for the League, he did a series of communal garments. Unfortunately, I don't have the opening night, but for opening night, we had a mile-long red garment, 5 feet wide, with a head hole every 5 feet. And everybody at the opening got in and made a snake, totally circling the block. Now, just to talk about, I spent 1 month getting the insurance for this.
It's like Alejandro Jodorowsky. You know Alejandro Jodorowsky, the surrealist?
Yes. And if you haven't seen a movie called El Topo, it is, this guy made a movie for 0 budget. He bought out-of-date film with expired dates. Every actor worked for nothing, made their own costumes, and it's one of the great westerns of all time. Shot it in Mexico.
It's a surrealist western, and it looks like the people look like that.
Right. So it was there were about a dozen different of these garments. Here's Mr. North-South and his family making them in Chinatown. Well, they were in Chinatown. Here we are in the gallery. And this is opening night. We had two in a hat down here and then up there. And here's Myers making a fuss about something. And this is the Pink Silk Airplane, which you were invited to come in and get in a head hole and then talk about Wittgenstein. And this is the mile-long dress. We had a person in front of the Metropolitan Museum and one at Grand Army Plaza. And I spent a week on the phone trying to get a parade permit to try to close Fifth Avenue, and somehow they wouldn't buy it. But I'm trying to think of her name, but there was this woman who's the head of the cultural affairs in the Parks Department who was like really big in supporting the arts. Lindsay really, was supportive of this cultural stuff, the mayor at the time. And so we got a permit to do this on the sidewalk along Central Park on Fifth Avenue. And then one of the projects we did, it was really incredible, was Dial a Poem, where John Giorno organized leading poets, including Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, and we put their poetry on tape. Now, this is before computers, so in those days, when you called a movie theater to get the schedule, you come in the middle of the loop, and you'd have to wait for it to get back to the beginning again. So we got those machines. And you call in, and you'd be coming somewhere on a loop, and it would very seldom repeat because we had 10 lines, and you would hunt up, depending upon how many people were currently calling, and then you come in the middle of the loop somewhere. And so you could spend a lot of time calling in. It was we had to pay, if it would have been a 900 number, they would have paid us. But they didn't have that then. So we had to pay, I had to raise $1,000 every month for the phone bill. And after we got 1 million calls, the Architectural League said, okay, you prove your point, take them out of there. But it was, just pioneering of stuff that you could do. Now, I got a challenge for all of you. Having looked at this, how many people have $50 in cash in their pocket or $50 on their credit card? Okay, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but you know who you are, okay? You could do every one of these projects by the weekend. In other words, this was not a matter of resources. You go down to Canal Street and buy plastic, you get an iron and an ironing board, and you heat seal it, and get a fan, and you've done it. And so, and this is a drawing. All you need is
Except for the $1,000 phone.
You could do this on the internet with WordPress for free. I mean, my websites, I pay a designer and then I get a URL, but you people don't know how to get around that. You just use WordPress and you can do it for free.
But there's a difference aesthetically now between low-tech and computers. There's a whole question about that.
Yeah, so you'd have to decide what you want to do. But the point I'm making, what you saw today was not, Habitat obviously was a big deal. But most of what you saw today was not made possible by huge corporate resources. It was made possible by the imagination. So now, my take on what this was all about. And that is, first of all, why it happened. And this is an idea put forward by Daniel Moynihan. When a small culture invades a big culture, the big culture usually will absorb the small culture. Whoever invades China becomes Chinese. So each new generation is a small culture and gets absorbed by the dominant culture. There's something called the baby boom. For 3 or 4 years, nobody had children because they were all fighting the war. Then everybody came home and had children, and huge explosion. I mean, the fierceness with which people were just trying to build schools to handle this snake. The snake had swallowed a pig, and it's moving through the snake. And each time it hits it, right now it's hitting retirement, so it's going to wipe out, your savings. So the younger culture overwhelmed the dominant culture. What are the values of a adolescent culture? Defiance of authority and idealism. So notice that none of the figures I've showed you were baby boomers, but they had absorbed this adolescent culture. Now, what happened? For one moment, there was something I feel rivaled Periclean Greece and the Florentine Renaissance, and then it was over. Wikipedia says one interpretation was a classical Jungian nightmare cycle, when a rigid culture, unable to contain the demands for greater individual freedom, broke free of the social constraints of the previous age through extreme deviation from the norm. I don't buy that, but this is an interpretation of Wikipedia. This is my interpretation. Every culture we have seen in this course has been the one same culture. It was developed in Mesopotamia, and it has spread throughout the globe. This is all the same culture. It is focused on a hierarchical social order that crushes the individual. For one brief shining moment, some broke free of that culture, back to the spiritual individualism of the shaman, and each individually experienced the cosmos as it is, not through the lens of a dominant culture, but they could not hold their freedom, and the priesthood again took over, crushing them back into the hierarchy.